If you give me 6 lines written by the hand of the most honest of men, I will find something in them which will hang him. These lines were written by Cardinal Richelieu, who lived in the 17th century. He was one of the advisors of King Louis XIII, and he had a great career reading other people's mail and finding words in that mail which seemed to indicate some kind of opposition to King Louis XIII and hanging them for it. That was his job on behalf of the king, to ferret out opponents of the king and develop evidence with which to hang them. Why am I starting this YouTube video with that? Because some people are doing that to me. They're using the letters that Elizabeth and I wrote to each other during the Christmas 1984-1985 holidays, and they're taking passages out of context and using them to make me look like a killer, which I am not. And in this video, I want to address these false accusations and these misinterpretations of these letters, which fit in perfectly with what Cardinal Richelieu was doing back then 400 years ago. It's not fair then, and it's not fair now. The fact is that the letters that Elizabeth and I exchanged, both hers and mine, do not contain any fantasies of violence or any plans for murder. It's just not true. The letters show that Elizabeth disliked, perhaps even hated her parents, and that I supported her in these emotions. And that's not nice, that's not good. But there's nothing in these letters, either hers or mine, that has to do with violence, let alone any planning for murder. It's just not in there. And people who tell you something else are not telling you the truth. They're using sentences taken out of context for their own purposes because they have an agenda. We're going to look at these letters today. But before we do that, we need to remind ourselves that there are 2 theories of the case here. Under the first theory of the case, I am the perpetrator and Elizabeth is the instigator. Under the other theory of the case, Elizabeth is the perpetrator and I am the accessory after the fact. One of these 2 theories has to be true. No other way. Point is, these letters cannot tell us which one of those 2 theories is true. The letters fit exactly equally well on both theories. They don't actually bring us any closer to finding out who committed this crime. The only thing these letters show is that there was ill will between Elizabeth and her parents, and I supported her in that. There's nothing else to be found in these letters. And logically speaking, how else could that be? They were written 3 months before the murders. So they cannot tell us who did what, because it hadn't happened yet, it was still in the future. Let's look at what's actually in these letters. We're starting off with Elizabeth's letters, which were written 3 weeks after the start of our relationship. We became a couple at the beginning of December 1984, and she wrote me a 3-page letter from December 20th to December 22nd, 1984. On December 21st, she wrote me, "My parents begin to drink. My father says that the juniper extract used to flavor gin is a potent poison or drug. It causes similar aggression as speed. My mother begins her 6th gin. I pray she'll use the poker on my cold, goading father." These are ugly words, they're disturbing words, but there is no violence from Elizabeth in these words, and there is no murder plan. She's saying that she hopes her mother will use the poker on her father, not that Elizabeth wants to use it, or that she wants me to use it. This is not a fantasy of killing somebody. It's just not. Then she writes, and this will become important later, there have been many burglaries in this area recently. I'll come back to that in just a second. The next day, December 22nd, she wrote, "Would it be possible to hypnotize my parents? Do voodoo on them, will them to death? It seems my concentration on their death is causing them problems. My father nearly drove over a cliff at lunch. He nearly got squashed by a tree when he got home, and he keeps falling over. And my mother, drunk, fell into the fire. I think I shall seriously take up black magic." Again, harsh words, ugly words, disturbing words, but there is no violence here. Voodoo has nothing to do with this crime. If it had, then the prosecutor would surely have said something about that, either at Elizabeth's trial or at my trial. But that never happened, and that's because voodoo has nothing to do with this case. I know it was out in the media, but in court, and at the end of the day, that's the only thing we can really go with. In court, voodoo was never mentioned, neither was black magic. These letters are not nice, but they have nothing to do with murder fantasies or fantasies of violence. It's just not true. And we're talking about Elizabeth's letters here, so I'm kind of defending her, which is not usual for me. After I received these letters from her, I wrote her back. I wrote her December 27th, 1984 to January 13th, 1985. I wrote her 32 pages. I was a nerd, what can I say? Single space typed letters, 32 pages. The sum total of what I wrote about the Haysums is maybe half a page out of 32 pages. I'm linking all of this stuff up in the program description, the video description. Check this out for yourself. Don't believe me? Check it out. I always link up all my stuff. I'm not afraid. So, let's see what I wrote in response to her. By the way, were I to meet your parents, I have the ultimate weapon. Strange things are happening within me. I'm turning more and more into a Christ figure, a small imitation anyway, I think. I believe I would either make your parents completely lose their wits, get heart attacks, or they would become lovers in an agape kind of way of the rest of the world. Yeah, I wrote that, and it's strange and it's disturbing, and I wish I had not written it. But there's no violence in here. There's no talk of murder in here. The only thing that even comes close is the heart attacks. And sadly, unfortunately, Derek and Nancy Haysum did not die of heart attacks. They died in a really horrible, horrible way. So this is not related to the crime that happened 3 months later. They did not lose their wits, they did not get heart attacks, and they did not become lovers in an agape kind of way of the rest of the world. It's just nothing to do with the case. The word weapon is in quotation marks. That should tell you that it's meant metaphorically. And guess what? Later on in the same letter, I explain what the weapon is. And the people who use these letters against me now, they never give you this passage. They always skip this. Ask yourselves why. I'll read it to you. Love is a form of meditation, and love is the ultimate weapon against your parents. Ha. Of course, the people who are trying to make me look guilty do not want you to know that the ultimate weapon is love. Of course they don't want you to know that. Because now it sounds like I'm a silly teenager who's listened to too many love songs, which is actually the truth. The next sentence in this letter is, my God, how I've got the dinner scene planned out. They really like using that against me. I gotta say the prosecutor tried using this against me at my trial too. Why? The murders of Derek and Nancy Haysum happened in 3 rooms. The living room, the dining room, and the kitchen. There's a lot of blood in all 3 of those rooms. And this passage about the dinner scene would seem to fit that because there was violence apparently in the dining room. Now I'm showing you a few photographs here of the dining room at the crime scene. And you can see that there are 2 place settings there. One for Derek Haysum and one for Nancy Haysum. There's not a place setting for a 3rd guest or 4th guest. Just not. There are 2 place settings there. So there was no dinner scene. That's number 1. Number 2, look at the table. There's only a little bit of blood on the table, very little. And then there are 2 candlesticks and 2 wine glasses on the table that are still standing up. They were not knocked over. And that tells you that there was no violence in that area because nobody even bumped against the table. If somebody had bumped against that table, like if there had been a fight, then those candlesticks and those wine glasses would have been knocked over. But they weren't because there was no dinner scene. I'm also showing you a couple of other pictures from the kitchen area. You can see that the dinner dishes are actually already on the counter and in the sink. Why? Because dinner was over whenever this happened. I don't know because I wasn't there, but clearly dinner was over. There was no dinner scene. There is no relationship between this sentence and the crime scene. What did I mean by the dinner scene? Close to 4 weeks before I wrote this line, I had just started a new relationship with a new girlfriend. I don't know what it's like nowadays, but back then the way it used to be is that when you had a new girlfriend, sooner or later, you have to meet her parents. And almost always, 99% of the time, you meet your girlfriend's parents at dinner. As it happened, I actually ended up meeting Derek and Nancy Haysum at lunch. So this nearly came true the way I thought, but I thought I would meet them at dinner. And that's all that this sentence refers to. It's perfectly normal when you have a new girlfriend, sooner or later I gotta meet her parents, and I'm probably gonna meet them for dinner. Where else? 4 days after that letter, or 3 days, on January 3rd, 1985, I wrote about the Haysums again, right after I got this letter from Elizabeth that I read to you just a second ago about the burglaries and the voodoo. And now, here, I'm responding to that. To your actual letter, the fact that there have been many other burglaries in the area opens the possibility for another one with the same general circumstances. By the way, yes, voodoo, etc. is possible. So again, I'm not happy about this. This is disturbing. I received Elizabeth's letter with all this, it wasn't that much really, but there was some ill will between her and her parents and talk of burglaries and talk of voodoo. And I fed into it. And I wish I had not, and I regret that. But there was no burglary at the Haysom crime scene. Nothing was taken from the Haysom crime scene. So burglaries have nothing to do with this. And also, as I mentioned earlier, there's no voodoo to do with the Haysom case. There just isn't. What did I mean with voodoo is possible? Back then I was a psychology student, and this is something that psychology students learn about. There's something called autosuggestion, and it basically means that you believe something so strongly that you make it come true. And that happens in an extreme case with voodoo. In Haiti, some people believe so strongly in the powers of a witch doctor that they actually die. They lose the will to live because they've convinced themselves that the witch doctor has this power over them. It's called autosuggestion. You'll learn about it in psychology class, and that's what I meant here. Again, voodoo has nothing to do with this case. If it had, then the prosecutor would have at least mentioned it at Elizabeth's trial or my trial, but the prosecutor never ever mentioned it because it did not happen. There's no relation to the case. So you see, these are the actual sentences, the words that have to do with Derek and Nancy Haysom in my letter. There's nothing in here about murder, and there's nothing in here about violence. And the weapon is love. That's what's in my actual letters. And of course, that's not very helpful to people who want me to look guilty. So what do? They go to a completely different letter in this collection, which has nothing to do with the Haysoms, and they pick sentences out of it, out of context, to make me look bad. Let's look at this. The last mention of the Haysoms in my letters was on January 3rd. 1 full week later, on January 10th, I write another letter. And now we're going to look at this letter because this is the one where people who think I'm guilty pull sentences out of context like Cardinal Richelieu did back 400 years ago in France. I'll read you the letter, the part that they don't tell you about. This is the part that puts the context around what was actually said. I just got through reading 2 excellent articles on World War II and its ending, and the anticipated celebration on the 8th of May in the German magazine Der Spiegel. The article, not the celebrations. The worldview of the bankers and lawyers, the entrepreneurs, the tough guys, the realpolitica of every description, literal and metaphorical, in short, of almost everyone around, driven to its absolute conclusion. Hitler killing millions, Stalin killing millions before and after him, Roosevelt and Churchill killing millions by ordering them to relocate from territories transferred to Russia, and by the use of the atom bomb, an unneeded second time at the very least. The conclusion one of the articles draws, and mine for some time now, every man is a potential war criminal. Elizabeth, I find this thought so overwhelmingly horrible it's hard to describe, and I haven't even lived through stuff like that. So what does this tell you? It tells you that this letter is not about Derek and Nancy Haysom, it's about a couple of articles about the end of World War II and mass murder by Hitler and Stalin, and the idea that every man is a potential war criminal. Yeah, but that's just stuff I'm making up, right? Turns out that magazine and that article can still be found. I found it. I'm linking it up for you here. Take a look. That's the cover. And here you can see, in German of course, the sentence where the author of the article writes in German, this sentence that I'm quoting here, every man is a potential war criminal. That's what he was writing about. And what was my reaction to the thought that every man is a potential war criminal? I wrote, I find this thought so overwhelmingly horrible. And what did I then do? Being the little nerd that I was, I tried to work with that thought. I tried to understand that thought. If every man is a war criminal, then there must be something even in me that has this potential. And that's a horrible thing to realize when you're 18 years old, when you're first waking up to these ideas. So that's what the letter is about. And I write, when I'm exploring this idea that I have this in me, if every man is a potential war criminal, then I must have this potential too. I write about this in this letter, and I write, I've felt this, I'm feeling it now inside me, this need to plant one's foot in someone's face, to always crush. Thank you, Orwell, for that metaphor you borrowed. To plant one's foot in somebody's face, to always crush. That sounds like a violent fantasy, doesn't it? At first glance, it does. But that's not what this passage is about. And you can see that from me mentioning Orwell. George Orwell was a 20th century author, winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he's best known for his novel, 1984. Remember, I was writing this on January 10th, 1985. 1984 had just finished, so there was a bunch of articles in the media. Is the real 1984 like the 1984 in George Orwell's novel? And I'd read this book in school, and I'm actually a huge fan of George Orwell. And it's George Orwell in 1984 who wrote, "If you want a vision of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever." That's what I was writing about here. This is not a murder fantasy or a fantasy of violence. This is me paraphrasing George Orwell, whom I mention in this sentence. Thank you, Orwell, for that metaphor you borrowed. But by pulling this out of context, some people try to make me look like a monster, when all I really am is a George Orwell fan. And what I've done is, I've actually found a video of George Orwell discussing this specific quote, because it's really famous. The one that I'm referring to here, "Plant one's foot in somebody's face to always crush." That quote is really famous, and George Orwell, shortly before he died, gave an interview in which he talks about this specific sentence. It's really cool, and it's available on YouTube, and I've linked it up for you. Check it out. George Orwell is so cool anyway, right? But this interview is really nice. And it tells you, again, I was not writing about the murders of Derek and Nancy Haysom. I was writing about an article in a magazine about World War II and a novel by George Orwell. And then I go on to write, "I have not yet explored the side of me that wishes to crush to any real extent. I have yet to kill possibly the ultimate act of crushing." Yeah, exactly. I'm writing about World War II and George Orwell. I'm not writing about Derek and Nancy Haysom. The last time I mentioned Derek and Nancy Haysom in any way in these letters was 10 days earlier. 10 days earlier, on January the 3rd. But if you pull quotes out of context, you can make people say almost anything. But that doesn't make it right. Doesn't make it right. I hope I've brought some clarity to the question of what these letters actually say and what they don't say. Again, the letters show that Elizabeth had a problem with her parents, and the letters show that I supported her, that I fed into this, that I participated in these emotions. But they do not give you any clue at all which one of us is the actual killer. And they can't, because they were written 3 months before the murders. Why do people do this? Why do people take sentences out of context and use them against me in these letters? Because people who believe I'm guilty have a real problem. I have no motive. That was not a problem for the prosecutor at my trial, because in order to convict somebody of murder, you do not need to prove motive. You only have to prove intent, and that's not the same. For that reason, the prosecutor really didn't try very hard to prove motive. I had told the police in my false confession, and which Elizabeth also supported later on in her statements to the police, was that her parents opposed our relationship, and that was the motive for these horrible crimes. The key thing to understand there is that there was absolutely no independent evidence to support this. The only people who ever said that Derek and Nancy Haysom were against Elizabeth and my relationship were Elizabeth and I. And we were trying to sell the police a story, which was not true. The prosecutor had 4 years between my arrest and my trial to try to find somebody, anybody, who was willing to testify that they had heard Derek and Nancy Haysom say they were against the relationship between Elizabeth and me. But they couldn't find anybody, the prosecutor, because there wasn't such a person, because they were not against our relationship. They barely knew I existed. I met Derek and Nancy Haysom once for about half an hour. I don't think they even really had me on their radar. They might have been aware of me vaguely. Why should they be? Fact is, Nancy Haysom's best friend, Annie Massey, testified at my trial. Another family friend testified at my trial. Other people close to Haysom's testified at my trial. Not one of them, nobody was able to support this theory that the Haysoms were against my relationship with their daughter. It's just a story that Elizabeth and I told the cops. That's all. So there is no motive. And it's not just me saying that. In 2016, Elizabeth gave an interview to the Richmond Times-Dispatch, which I've linked up, where you can check this out yourself. Elizabeth also said that that was not the real motive. In 2016, on September 11th actually, it's 2016, Elizabeth gave an interview in which she said that she had lied at her own trial when she said that there was no sexual abuse by her mother. And she said she lied at my trial when she again said there was no sexual abuse by her mother. And now, 26 years later, in 2016, she said she was finally able to tell the truth. And the truth was she was sexually abused by her mother with the knowledge of her father. I don't know whether that's true, but that's what she says. She says in 2016, she says, my parents, especially my mother, sexually abused me. And then she goes on to say, that's actually the real motive why Jens killed my parents. And that's, of course, nonsense. Because why should I kill her parents for sexually abusing her? Sexual abuse is a motive for her, but not for me. It makes no sense. And if you then look at the nature of the wounds, they call it overkill, dozens of stab wounds, horrible injuries to the neck, that makes sense if the person committing the crime has a really deep, powerful personal hatred against these people. Who would have such a deep, powerful personal hatred of Derek and Nancy Hazen? Somebody who's met them once for 30 minutes, or somebody who says that she was sexually abused by them? Why don't you answer that question? And let me know what you think in the comments below.